Lenin defined imperialism as capitalism in the age of monopoly. The state and capital grow together and unite to take profit from other countries. There are imperialist policies. However, imperialism itself is not a policy. It's a stage of capitalism. It cannot be voted away under capitalism. It cannot be reformed away. It is an inherent feature of capitalism. Each state defends the interests of its capitals. This is inherent in capitalism. The state is the state of capital in a particular territory. Imperialism helps its economy squeeze out profits from the two sources of wealth that Marx identified, nature and labor. So it wants control of raw materials, and it wants exploitation of labor in the colonized or imperialized country. Imperialism is fundamentally economic. The military backs up economic penetration. Strategic military intervention is to back up economic interests, both either the long term or the short term. So the national interest of a particular imperial state is interpreted in light of specific corporate interests. Policy is set by continual struggle among those corporations and capitals. There is no separate economic and territorial logic, as some Marxists like Alex Kalinikos, for example, tried to maintain. In fact, the so-called territorial logic is just long-term economic logic. Politics is concentrated economics, war is concentrated politics. So if we look at one example of this, would be the US and Vietnam. There were no real immediate economic interests for the US in Vietnam, but it had to shore up the US bloc, the so-called free world, against the so-called communist bloc. For Lenin, the key thing about the modern stage of imperialism was that it was based on capital export, that is, on the exploitation of foreign labor. It's supplemented by control of raw materials, supplemented by unequal exchange, where foreign capitalists do not get to keep all of their, quote, surplus value. As Ashley Smith puts it in his article that we read for this, capitalism's logic of competition drives corporations beyond the national economy in search of resources, markets, and labor throughout the world. Each capitalist state builds huge military arsenals to enforce the corporation's claims in the system. Thus, economic competition between capitals produces imperial competition between states for the division and redivision of the world. These rivalries can trigger war between the great powers. The victors of these conflicts attempt to enforce a new hierarchy among the capitalist states. But such hierarchies, Lenin and Bukharin argue, are never permanent. Old powers atrophy, new capitalist powers rise, and they come into conflict as each attempt to order the system to their advantage of its capitalist class. Or, as President Woodrow Wilson during World War I put it, since trade ignores national boundaries and the manufacturer insists on having the world as a market, the flag of his nation must follow him, and the doors of the nations which are closed against him must be battered down. Concessions obtained by financiers must be safeguarded by ministers of state, even if the sovereignty of unwilling nations be outraged in the process. Today, the major world imperialist powers are the US, China, and Russia, but lesser imperialist powers include the EU countries. So in order to understand the situation of imperialism today, we need to look briefly at the period after World War II. Before World War II and during World War II, most of the global South was colonized directly, politically controlled by imperial states in Europe, the United States, Japan, etc. However, there's a massive struggle in all those colonial areas, which forced the colonial powers out. And the imperialists learned that they could dominate economically in the global South without direct political control. After this period, there were two blocks. There was the so-called free world, which was monopoly private capitalists, led by the United States and secondarily by Western Europe. And there was communism, so-called communism, or what I would call state capitalism, where the state owned the means of production, but workers were still exploited by the ruling class. The US defended the free world, so-called free world, in order to have a larger area for its corporations to invest. The US was willing to accept some nationalist policies within the free world in order to thwart so-called communism. The Cold War ended around 1989 to 1991, and there was one superpower, unipolar moment And this is the period that Ben seems to be fixated on, that we're still in that unipolar moment. But even at that point, there are economic contradictions among the various powers. This is an age of globalization where the World Trade Organization was attempted by the US to impose rules on the world. If this included structural adjustment in the third world, rejection of nationalist policies, etc. This was the so-called New World Order that George H.W. Bush proclaimed when he attacked Iraq in 1991. There was an attempt to colonize Russia and Russian resistance. There was a new Cold War with Russia, centering around the attack by the United States on Serbia over the issue of Kosovo and the expansion of NATO, which was against the promises that the US made. Russia tried to reinsert imperial control over the old USSR empire. Under Putin, they attacked Chechnya, where at least 35,000 people were killed, Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, Kazakhstan in 2022, etc. They set up the Eurasian Union and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. The situation today is one of asymmetrical multipolarity, as Ashley Smith puts it, because the US is dominant militarily, but is facing more economic and even military competition. The US is still, as Martin Luther King put it, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, and it is the main guarantor of world capitalism. What has changed is the rise of several states, especially China, economically and militarily, and Russia's reassertion militarily. The defeat of the US in Iraq and Afghanistan opened the way for China to move forward, and this is especially true after the crash of 2008, where China did much better coming out of this than the US. The weakening of the US power to impose its will continued with an opening of new anti-bloc US blocs, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization by China, the Eurasian Economic Union by Russia. On Ukraine, today, the only full backers of the US on Ukraine are the EU, Japan, Canada, and Australia. This is what the US calls the, quote, international community. Others are reluctant or opposed. Even Saudi Arabia, even Israel, India, Brazil, China. Majority of the world's population today are governed by states which are opposed to the US on Ukraine. So the US hype that Russia is isolated is just that, it's hype. The result of all this has been a declining dollar, with talk of the dollar no longer being the world reserve currency. There has been a decline of globalization since the crisis of 2008, 2009, with the rise of protectionism, blockification, meaning trade and investment within particular blocks rather than internationally. This means, at least on this one issue, Trump is not an aberration. The coming economic crisis, which has been predicted by Marxist economists like Michael Roberts and many others, will accelerate this. Declining profit will mean increased intensifying competition and rising military tensions. Concentration of wealth and the stagnation of living standards in the West and every place around the world has not ended the crisis of profitability for the capitalists. They will therefore continue their intense competition. This will cause ruling classes to try to divide workers along national lines. China has risen as a new imperialist power with its Belt and Road Initiative. There's conflicts between China and the US, et cetera, and other countries in the South China Sea, over Taiwan, investment in Africa, Latin America, where China, I believe in Africa, is now the most biggest investor, not the United States. And of course, China's intervention in the Middle East, where it just brokered an Iran-Saudi diplomatic agreement. China claims to be against hegemony, but it has a softer form of imperialism using loans from the Asian Development Bank, et cetera, and it has over $1 trillion in foreign investment. The US response to the rise of China initially was to try to incorporate China as a manufacturing platform only. However, the Chinese response frustrated this, and China has become an independent center of accumulation. This led to the pivot to Asia by Obama and Trump's tariffs. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Obama pushed, and Trump dropped. And then it promoted the US to impose AFRICOM, which is a military intervention in Africa. Overall, Lenin's theory still applies, and so do his politics. Fundamentally, the attitude that we as Marxists need to take is for international working class solidarity and the socialist revolution. Support to any imperialist power by workers disrupts international solidarity. Support to self-determination of nations creates unity. That is, the imperialist state allowing the oppressed state to pull away from it. Imperialism is capitalism, the age of monopoly. This is still true. As in World War II, there are still competing imperialist powers economically and growing economic or military competition. The world is more prone to war than it ever has been. There are alternative analyses. In Lenin's time, there was Minkowski's ultra-imperialism. There was an analysis of the anti-globalization movement, which put forward the idea that states were no longer important, that only corporations were important. We can get into this in discussion. There are different positions on the left on Ukraine today. The question is Russia imperialist is important. Tony Cliff wrote about Russian imperialism even under Stalin. He said that the Russians, when they took over Eastern Europe, actually directly stole capital, took capital out and transported it to Russia. And they also imposed advantageous trade terms that were advantageous to Russia. After the fall of Stalinism, Russia today is one of the lower tier economically imperialist powers with $335 billion in foreign investment, compared to the US $6 trillion and China's $1 trillion plus. However, Russia also seeks to dominate what it calls its near abroad, that is through the Eurasian Economic Union, which includes Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia. The question of US arms aid to Ukraine has been a crucial division within the left. There are groups that support US aid to Ukraine on the basis that the main issue is the self-determination of Ukraine. Workers' Voice and Tempest have taken this position. I think this is a very wrong position because it subordinates the need for international solidarity and revolution to the principle of self-determination. The principle of self-determination by Marxists is conditional. The example of Serbia in World War I is a good example of that. Serbia was a small nation oppressed by Austro-Hungary, and socialists supported Serbia's right of self-determination against Austro-Hungary. However, when World War I broke out, the Russians used Serbia as their excuse for going into the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary. At that point, socialists dropped or pulled way back from the idea of self-determination for Serbia because it had been a slogan of Russian imperialism. Today in the US, on the other side, on the opposite end, which I think is also bad, is what we call campism, which says that the US is the only imperialist power. Opposing imperialism, this line says, means just opposing the US. Campism, support like PSL and other groups, support the, quote, legitimate security interests of Russia. And I think this is really wrong because it ignores imperialism as a world system. It ignores the need for international solidarity, and it leads to the kind of stuff that Ben talked about at the very end. That is opposing working class struggle in countries that oppose the US for fear of supporting US interests. It means dismissing the revolutions that take place in Iran and other places. This is a disastrous position if we want international solidarity. Our overall approach to fighting imperialism needs to be this. The interests of the working class are what come first, rejection of all imperialists. As the International Socialist Tendency said during the Cold War, neither Washington nor Moscow, but workers' power and international socialism. Today, we would also include neither Washington nor Moscow nor Beijing. As Marx put it, a people that oppresses another cannot itself be free. The working class will never revolt against its own government and ruling class, while it supports that government and ruling class in oppressing other nations. In each country, the main enemy is at home. Solidarity with working class and oppressed people needs to take place every place across the world. How this applies is that we support self-determination of Ukraine against Russia, but we oppose US and NATO intervention, including arms. And their attempt is a way to dominate Ukraine and bring it into NATO, the EU, etc. Self-determination is a demand that has to be subordinated to the needs of the revolution. Our most important goal as Marxists in the United States is to win the working class away from US imperialism. As Ashley Smith summarizes the article, socialists should not take sides between imperialist rivals. While we in the United States have a primary responsibility to oppose US imperialism, we must also oppose the rival, if lesser, imperialism and Beijing, Moscow. None of these gangs of thieves represent the interests of the laboring majority. We should instead stand in solidarity with the popular risings of working masses and oppressed nations, no matter what camp they are in. Their struggle is part of our struggle against capitalist system that stokes the interstate rivalry and war. Or as Lenin put it in his article, Socialism and War, it is not the business of socialists to help the younger and stronger robber to rob the older, overgorged robbers. Socialists must take advantage of the struggle between the robbers to overthrow them all. To be able to do this, socialists must first of all tell people the truth, namely that this war is a war between slave owners to fortify slavery. Picture yourselves a situation where a slave owner who owned 100 slaves was warring against a slave owner who owned 200 slaves for a more just distribution of the slaves. The application of the term defense of the fatherland would be ridiculous in this case. Lenin was opposed to the backing any imperialist against any other, whether they are small or large. If we are to achieve a socialist revolution, in order to go back to Marx's slogan in the Communist Manifesto, "Workers of the world unite," we have to oppose both and all imperialist camps. Thank you.